We're proud to support the craft of journalism. UBS brings you the latest news from around the world with The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Be part of an international network that brings together leading insights, research and technology across 24 time zones and 12 key financial hubs, with you at the centre of it all. UBS. Advice is our craft.
You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 22nd of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
Cari fratelli e sorelle, buona Pasqua.
The final public words of Pope Francis, spoken on Easter Sunday. Well, as a period of mourning begins following his death, we look ahead to the next 9 days. Also ahead, we examine the legacy of a pontiff not afraid to speak out in the name of peace. We'll ask if his legacy will have a lasting effect on security and international relations. Plus,
historically speaking, tariffs have been used primarily as a tool of domestic economic policy more than as a tool of economic warfare.
We hear from the author Edward Fishman, who explains why the global economy has become America's weapon of choice in the 21st century. Plus the newspapers, the latest on a ramped-up joint military exercise between the US and the Philippines, plus the latest news from men's fashion too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Harvard University has sued the Trump administration after it froze up to $2 billion in funding. President Trump has stood behind his defense secretary, dismissing as fake news reports that Pete Hegseth shared sensitive military information on a second chat group. And President Sheinbaum of Mexico has asked the country's television channels to pull an advertisement by the US President Donald Trump because it could incite violence. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, yesterday, Pope Francis's personal rooms were locked and sealed, the fisherman's ring removed from his hand and smashed with a hammer. Well, tomorrow, his body will be moved to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome to lie in state for 3 days. Ritual dictates almost every moment of the aftermath of a pope's death, and the next few days will see a formal process for Catholics around the world to say farewell to Pope Francis. But Francis had already decided to change some of the traditions, and to tell us more, I'm joined now by the journalist, broadcaster and former Vatican correspondent Juliet Linley. A very good morning to you, Juliet, joining us on the line from Dufourstrasse 19 Zurich.
Very good morning to you, Emma.
Just explain to us that moment that none of us, dare we say, were surprised that the Pope was desperately ill before, so the news of his death was no great surprise. But it did seem to catch the Catholic world off guard a little, didn't it?
It really did, Emma, precisely because it came the day after he had appeared at the balcony at St. Peter's. He'd managed, as we heard earlier in the show, he'd managed to wish the faithful in the square a happy Easter, Buona Pasqua. And no one really thought that 24 hours later he would be gone. We were all prepared for a possible papal passing when he was hospitalized in the middle of February. He stayed in hospital those 38 days, during which there were 2 episodes in which he was practically on the verge of death. That's what his doctors confirmed to us when he then came out of hospital on March 23rd. But when he did come out, we were told, you will not see the Pope for 2 months. He needs to rest, recuperate, do physiotherapy for his voice, for his mobility, for his breathing. He had double pneumonia. And so we didn't expect to see him. But then all of a sudden there were all these, what I like to call papal pop-ups, especially in Holy Week, which is the holiest week for the Catholic Church, which is the days leading up to Easter Sunday when Christ is resurrected. And so with all those pop-ups, he appeared in the Basilica informally just to go and say a little prayer, much to the surprise of pilgrims who happened to be visiting the Basilica. But then he also he met King Charles, which wasn't on the cards, and Queen Camilla. So all of these led us to believe that he was on the mend, that maybe somehow he would keep going.
We now, though, have the enormous Vatican machine now starts to grind in terms of what happens next. I mean, I've briefly just touched upon a few of the traditions, the rituals that must be adhered to. But when it came to Pope Francis, he has changed an awful lot of what is expected of the next few days, isn't it?
Ever the pragmatist, Emma, ever the Pope who wants to simplify the trappings of the papacy. In November, just a few months ago, he approved new simplified rites for his own funeral, and they go from only wanting a single zinc-lined wooden coffin simply with the name Franciscus written on it, rather than previous popes who would have 3 coffins, one inside the other, of cypress wood, oak, lead, and so on. And then he decided that rather than having the body elevated when he will be lying in state, as of Wednesday, he only wants a open coffin during the vigil in St. Peter's Basilica. But perhaps most importantly, Emma, he's going against tradition by deciding that he is going to be buried outside of the Vatican. So he updated the rites to allow this option, and it was confirmed yesterday that instead of being buried behind Vatican walls, Pope Francis is going to be buried at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major. Now imagine, after the papal funeral, which will take place in St. Peter's, there is then going to be some sort of a procession and all the way across the city to San Giovanni, which is where Santa Maria Maggiore is. And it's going to be quite a logistical nightmare. Also in terms of security, you can imagine the millions of people that are going to be there, flocking from all over. And of course, remember, Emma, this is a holy year. It's a jubilee year. They come around every 25 years. And for there to be a conclave in a jubilee year is particularly exceptional. The last one was in 1605, and there were actually 2 conclaves in 1605. And now this year we're going to have this other new moment where you have both the Holy Year and a conclave taking place, and therefore a new pope will finish off the Holy Year.
Let's explore the conclave a little bit more. I mean, it is what's expected to be about 15 days before the conclave assembles. And we have a large group of cardinals journeying to Rome. We have, about 138 of them under the age of 80 become eligible to vote in this process. So tell us more.
That's exactly it. And as many people are pointing out, a large majority of these cardinals were appointed by Pope Francis, which would make you imagine that those were his efforts to sort of shape the College of Cardinals towards the church that he would like to see continuing into the future. So only cardinals under the age of 80 can vote. The dean of the College of Cardinals is Giambattista Re, and he's over 90, so he will be overseeing it, but he will not be voting in the conclave himself. So much to wonder about what is going to be the outcome of it. People are wondering when it'll be. It'll possibly be around between the 5th, the 6th, and the 10th of May. And as we know, when will it end, Emma? Who knows, because conclaves are open-ended. They can't leave that Sistine Chapel until they elect a new pope. And so there are, of course, people wondering, which pope is it going to be? Is the Catholic Church ready for a pope from Asia, for an African pope? Are the cardinals going to choose someone who will continue along Francis's path, or will they choose someone completely on the opposite end of the spectrum? So a conservative, perhaps closer to what Ratzinger was, who is the pope that Francis replaced in 2013.
Explain what we can do then, what we do know about what happens inside the conclave. I think many of us have a fair idea, having been able to watch the movie. But one wonders. But then when you suddenly wonder at what point things start to, how accurate a representation of what really happens inside the Sistine Chapel that film was.
Well, it's hard to exactly know because neither you nor me nor any members of the press have ever been inside the Sistine Chapel when the elections of the Pope were taking place. They need a 2/3 majority before a Pope can be confirmed. And there's a lot of sort of traditions, extra omnes is an expression you often hear. And that is what the Dean of the College of Cardinals or the Master of Papal Celebrations says when he shuts the doors of the majestic Sistine Chapel, saying everyone out except the princes of the church, the cardinals, who are going to be the ones who are charged with voting and choosing under the auspices of the Holy Spirit, mind you, according to Catholic faith, the person who will then lead the 1.4 billion Catholics around the world. So there's a lot of rituals there. But I do wonder, whether because Francis has been, in a way, such a divisive pope. And in a way, he was so forward-looking, but then he disappointed progressives by not being able to sort of change doctrine in order to institute some of the more forward-looking principles that he embraced. Whether what will come next, who will come next, and whether there will be a swing to perhaps someone like Cardinal Peter Erdo, the Hungarian ultra-conservative traditionalist, or whether there will be Fridolin Ambongo Bezungu from Kinshasa, an African pope, and perhaps Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, an Asian progressive choice. It's going to be so fascinating to see how things go, Emma.
The interesting thing about it is that when Pope Francis became the first South American pope, indeed the first Jesuits became to take the papacy, it meant that the group of cardinals that that now will be choosing his successor are a much less European group, and the church can wholly see itself as a global institution once again, which brings a sort of a modern relevance to it, doesn't it? I mean, this is all thanks to Francis.
That is absolutely the case. He brought in so many cardinals from what he calls the peripheries. So from, the southern hemisphere, from Asia, from Africa, from South America, whereas until Papa Wojtyla, until Pope John Paul II, who was elected in 1978, there had always been sort of Italian popes, generally speaking. So he's brought in so many foreign ones. And ironically, I was listening to one Vatican commentator saying the problem with that is that they are from such far-flung places that they don't know each other. And for the College of Cardinals to choose their successor, they need to discuss, they need to debate, they need to confer with each other. And a lot of them don't know each other at all. So over the next weeks, they're all going to be congregating in Rome. And this will be a chance for a lot of them to meet each other for the first time. And so I was thinking that a possible papabile, as they call the person who could be the next pope, could possibly be the Pope's number 2, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, precisely because he was an experienced diplomat, traveled all over the world for the Holy See, and therefore has met all of these, whereas so many haven't.
Let's have a look at how the world is covering this. And I know that one headline is talking about the Pope being the earthquake pontiff, and the fact that everywhere you look today, it's wall-to-wall coverage of Francis.
That is indeed the case. All the international press, the New York Times, the Pope who reset the course of the Catholic Church. In Switzerland, you've got the Neue Zürcher Zeitung say he was the Pope until the last minute because he managed to give his Easter blessing, and then 24 hours later he was gone. Tagesanzeiger headlines, Francis leaves behind a world church in transition. And then the FT is saying the modernizing pontiff in an era of populism and polarization. But what I looked at mainly, having just come back from Rome, Emma, to Zurich, was the Italian press. And, in Rome, the Pope is a really major figure. So many people, as soon as they heard that the Pope had died yesterday morning, said, I'm going down to St. Peter's. I have to be there. Whether they're faithful who are going there to pray for his soul, or whether they're curious people, or just Romans who just, you've got the Pope living right next door to you. He is such an important figure. And so you've got Corriere della Sera, La Repubblica, and Il Messaggero of Rome all with the same headline. And it's like, everyone is saying he was the Pope of the ultimi, of the last people, meaning he embraced those who are sort of at the end of the world, at the end of the earth, but also those who are marginalized in society. And then you do have La Verità, the newspaper, saying the Pope that created an earthquake in the church. And you have others saying, goodbye, Francesco. He shook up the Catholic Church. He was a Papa Scomodo. He was an uncomfortable Pope. So, yes, a spectrum of headlines, Emma, but certainly all over the press, whether nationally or internationally.
And shall remain so for some days to come. Juliet Linley in Zurich, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. Now, Pope Francis was seen very much as a man of peace as recently as on Sunday. He called for a lasting peace in the conflict in Ukraine and for an end to conflict in Sudan and South Sudan. The African Union said his voice carried moral clarity at a time when the world seemed most fractured. His was a papacy which highlighted the critical role of religions in building peace, but how much did it achieve? Well, I'm joined on the line now from Istria by Gorana Grgic, who's Monocle's security correspondent. Welcome back, Gorana.
Morning, Emma.
So there was this fearlessness, wasn't there, from Francis, that the church does not claim any authority over political affairs, yet he seemed to have a poignant comment for the world's biggest crises.
You're absolutely right. And I hate to follow Juliet, who was obviously a Vatican correspondent, in providing sort of an assessment of Pope Francis's legacy. But certainly when it comes to international affairs, to his sort of view on what the right foreign policy stances should be, it is very hard not to sort of reflect on what his voice meant, given that he so deeply weighed in and so potently weighed into commenting on the various crises that are going on around the world, calling for their resolution, and really spotlighting the three issues I would say have marked his papacy. And those are the issues of immigration or rights of migrants all across the world, given that we know that we live in a time when the number of people who have been displaced all around the world is the highest on record. The second issue being that of environmental crisis, and him speaking out about climate change and what the Catholic Church's role in all of this is. And finally, talking about the deep sense of global income inequality and how to help people who are marginalized, how to basically rethink the way that international economy and the relations between those that are powerful and powerless work to make the world more equitable and just. So I think, first of all, we can't go past that sort of agenda that he pushed to the very, very last day, I would say. And of course, what his death means for maybe Catholic Church's voice in all of this, but also now the tributes that we've heard coming from different world leaders, some past, some present, about the profound impact that he had.
His way of framing things was very, very subtle, wasn't it? That he would talk about, he would go to the Democratic Republic of Congo and Sudan to show that he was willing to put himself in places of conflict, not necessarily to speak out about what was right and wrong, but just to be there was an indication that there was an eye kept on what was going on in the world. And he would go and throw a wreath into the sea at the place where migrants would drown. And he would remind people of principles such as human rights and indeed, a more equitable world. How important is it to have a voice still like that when everything at the moment seems to be in total turmoil?
You're absolutely right about this idea of symbolism. And I think, very early into his pontificate, you mentioned he traveled to the island of Lampedusa, which is known as this gateway for migrants that are crossing the Mediterranean. And tragically, many of them perish in those very seas. And there he basically condemned what he called the globalization of indifference to the suffering of those who are fleeing war and poverty. And this continued on throughout his papacy. And you are absolutely right as well to point to some of these trips that had taken place, whether in Africa or in Asia, I think, or South America. I think what is really interesting about some of these trips is that he often went to places that there were not maybe as many Catholics, for sure, in places where there were quite sizable Catholic majorities in countries, but also in countries where maybe Catholics were the minority, and where actually Pope Francis did a lot to promote interfaith and interreligion dialogue, which I think is also a very important legacy. So there is a lot of symbolism there of him being that sort of moral conscious, moral compass, speaking out on things that, again, might not have been as spotlighted in some of his predecessors' pontificates. But at the same time, I would also say that he was quite unequivocal about these issues that he held so highly are the kind of points and just agenda of issues on the global menu, if you wish, of crises that need to be solved, and really pleading to different leaders to do something about that. And I would say, again, coming back to the three major ones: migration, global inequality, climate, and ecology. It is very clear what his thoughts were. I think on the issue of immigration, all the way to his very last months now, in February of this year, he penned a letter to U.S. bishops where he criticized the Trump administration deportation policies being damaging to human dignity and families, and he said that the kind of forced displacement and now the response of some of the governments are simply not something that he could live with, that land, that housing and work were basic human rights, and he was pleading with the U.S. bishops to do more to protect those, and recognizing that they are already doing that. But then on issues of, for instance, global inequality, he said that it is the economy that kills, that he very much said these words, that this economy kills, and targeted consumerism, different structures of exclusion. So very much, outspoken on those issues. And then what I thought was really something that I would say a lot of people who are dealing with issues of global environmental movement, of ecology, for instance, have applauded this idea of theological ecology, where the Pope early on, again in his papacy, penned an encyclical calling for ecological conversion. And quite interestingly, he gave that very book, it was called Laudato Si, to President Trump when he first met him in 2017. Now, I'm not sure if Donald Trump actually read that, but there he framed the environment as a moral and spiritual issue, and also pointed to the issue of climate justice, saying that it is the poor that suffer most from climate degradation. So,
Gorana Gojic, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
So in some ways, the Americans are more involved and the British are more involved than they have been publicly disclosing. But what the story shows is the US and the British are not running the war.
We hear from the journalist behind the story about a secret army base in Germany. This is The Globalist.
Craft is its own reward, which is why at UBS we're honoured to work alongside over 50 of today's leading Nobel laureates, each an expert in the art of economic science, bringing you engaging discussions, actionable insights, and inspired solutions, all focused around the questions that shape our world today. For a better outlook, find a Nobel perspective. UBS. Banking is our craft.
7:23 a.m. here in London. Let's have a look at the newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Monocle senior news editor Chris Chermak. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Emma.
Looking what a day. It's going to stay like this for a little while, I suspect. So let's have a look at the way that the world is covering it. We've heard Juliet in Zurich giving us a general overview of the fact that this is wall-to-wall coverage of the Pope's death across the papers. Are there any particular stories where people have attempted already a slightly different take on his legacy?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It is across all the papers, a lot of them covering the Pope's legacy, what's going to be happening next. I did pick out one story which sums up some of the views out of Germany in particular. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung has a column that basically talks about how, on the one hand, and you have been speaking about this with Juliet and others as well, Pope Francis was a modernizer, but he didn't necessarily do enough. And one thing that was interesting about how the Germans have been looking at this is that they had launched their own discussion among German Catholics. It was called the Synodal Way. It was a 3-year conference and series of discussions that were aimed at modernizing the Catholic Church, and it started in 2019. So some of the conversations in Germany are about basically Pope Francis, on the one hand, yes, wanting to launch discussions and sort of make some changes to how the Catholic Church operated. On the other hand, he did not engage with the Germans who were actually trying to launch a discussion with German Catholics as well. And that was a sign that some in Germany are saying, at least, that he still wanted to keep power within Rome. He didn't want churches outside of Rome to kind of have additional say. This is something that the Germans would have wanted in order to keep this discussion that they were having going. And some of the recommendations, and others, obviously, some that we've talked about as well, whether it is women priests and things like that, he was actually against. So there was a certain sort of centralization of power that Pope Francis kept, which could make things, not that easy going forward if the church hopes to keep modernizing in the next few years.
Indeed. There's an op-ed in the Times today as well, which mentions the same thing about the basic tension that every Christian faith says what's best to modernize or to lean into the counterculture aspects of faith. So this is something that's going to be discussed as well. A quick mention of the fact that J.D. Vance was the last public figure to visit the Pope.
He was the last public figure. It was a very brief visit, but that was interesting in itself, and the Washington Post and others are covering that. The fact that he got a meeting, that was quite questionable in itself, given how busy Pope Francis was on his final day. But there was a few minutes there for J.D. Vance at the end of the day on Sunday, just before he gave his Easter address. And yes, it shows, these two have had huge differences over the last few weeks and months, but J.D. Vance was deferential. It's something that, meeting the Pope surely will have changed him. He is a Catholic, a recently converted Catholic, so he was quite deferential, nonetheless also unapologetic about his policies.
Time to look at some other stories. Pete Hegseth is back in the headlines for the wrong reasons once again, and there is urgency, despite the fact that Donald Trump has dismissed the latest stories about him and Signal, the chat group, as fake news. There is pressure, it is understood, behind the scenes.
There is pressure, and this is essentially what has been across the U.S. newspapers over the past day, whether Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, can hold on or not. NPR had what they said was an exclusive that the White House is actually looking to replace Pete Hegseth as defense secretary. This was denied by the White House. At this point, Donald Trump is backing his defense secretary, as is the White House spokesperson. But yes, pressure has been growing for a couple of reasons. The New York Times broke this second Signal chat that he was having with his wife, his brother, and his lawyer, in which he also included details about this Yemen strike, in addition to which he's had various senior advisors resigning over leaks and other issues, which which just go to show that the pressure is building on Pete Hegseth. It'll be interesting to see whether Donald Trump does change his tune here and decides the guy is too much of a liability.
Finally, let's talk to those of us who still like to keep a bit of cash in our pockets when we go for something to eat. I suspect this might be you, Chris, because you wanted to draw our attention to a story in the Frankfurter Allgemeine about how suddenly Imbissstube, the places where we get our sausages, are finally succumbing to technology.
If it were only the sausage stands, Emma, I would understand this. This would be fine. But German restaurants, Emma, still struggle to offer card payments when you go around. Even in the capital, Berlin, tourists will be surprised to find that restaurants, after you have a nice big meal, they'll tell you at the end, sorry, we only take cash. And so this is one of these stories that is interesting. The Frankfurter Allgemeine has it that the coalition, the new coalition of the People's Party and the Social Democrats is considering requiring restaurants for the first time in Germany to offer card payments as an alternative to cash. This has caused a great uproar. Of course, the restaurant and hotel associations are in uproar. One of the reasons for this, it must be said, hotels and restaurants will deny that this has anything to do with it, but there's an estimate that about 15 billion in taxes are not paid as a result of cash being used in German restaurants and hospitality sectors. Might have something to do with it.
Well, we couldn't possibly say. This is actually in the coalition agreement, page 49.
This is actually in the coalition agreement that they will go after this. That's what's interesting. It's not just a discussion now. This is actually written down in the coalition agreement, although they have not yet set an exact deadline for when they will do this. They've just said they will start discussions, because this is the kind of third wheel of German politics, if you will. Who cares about defense and all those important issues? But yes, whether German restaurants can get card payments offered to their customers or not is a pretty big deal in Germany. I'll just say finally, interesting that, there's arguments about, how can rural places do this? I remember living in Germany and then traveling to Iceland, of all places, where even the most rural of towns offered cards, and yet Germany says, well, if we're in a bit of a rural area, I'm not sure we can do this.
What's contactless in German?
Contactless. They always we love using English words in German.
Fantastic. Useful for us all. Thank you so much, Chris Chermak. You're listening to Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7:30 a.m. A quick summary now of some of the other stories we're keeping an eye on today. Harvard University has sued the Trump administration after it froze up to $2 billion in funding. It's the latest stage in a dispute which escalated last week when the college rejected a series of demands made by the White House. President Trump stood behind his defense secretary, dismissing as fake news reports that Pete Hegseth shared sensitive military information on a second chat group, this time including his wife, his brother and personal lawyer. It related to the same attack on Houthi rebels in Yemen. And President Sheinbaum of Mexico has asked the country's television channels to pull an advertisement by the US President Donald Trump because it could incite violence. The ad warns against undocumented migration and has been aired during prime time programmes. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, for a closer look behind the headlines that we're following here at Midori House, here's Monocle's Deputy Head of Radio, Tom Webb, talking about Tokyo's plans for its own version of New York's Highline Park.
The many elevated expressways that snake through Tokyo are a defining feature of the city, but times and technology has changed. The raised KK Line Expressway, a 2-kilometre-long toll-free stretch that runs through the central Ginza district, has been a key piece of Tokyo's complex infrastructure puzzle since it opened in 1966. Its history came to an end earlier this month when the road was closed to traffic. The plan is to turn the old road into a pedestrianised green artery, giving Tokyo its own version of New York's High Line. Tokyo Sky Corridor is a long-term project which will open up in phases and is expected to take a decade to reach completion. Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike was on hand to launch proceedings on Friday, and the momentous shift from cars to pedestrians was marked with a schedule of public roof park events, including guiding walks and live music. Tokyo is a restless city, always under construction. This plan is part of a bigger picture which includes moving a chunk of elevated expressway at Nihonbashi Underground to connect with a new circular expressway, the subterranean Shinkoshibashi Link Road.
That was Monocle's Tom Webb. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for a free daily newsletter from us, the Monocle Minute. Just go to monocle.com/minute. Now, in late March, the New York Times published an investigation by the journalist Adam Entus. It revealed a previously secret German base in Wiesbaden, where the US and Ukrainian military leaders would meet under the Biden administration to talk about tactics and battle plans, offering a look behind the scenes at the highest level of defence planning. Well, Monocle's Juliet Linley spoke to Entus to hear about why it was important to pursue the story and why the Trump administration might yet lose out by not continuing a closer partnership with the Ukrainians.
Well, I mean, the Kremlin basically had been alleging that, the Americans were fighting with them, that this was NATO fighting Russia. And there's a kernel of truth in that at this base, Ukrainian, American, and other coalition partners work together. They help provide the Ukrainians with very precise intelligence that tells them where the Russians are located on their soil, and later in the partnership in 2024, including in some areas of Russia itself. And they work together, sat side by side in Wiesbaden to help plan the counteroffensives that the Ukrainians launched against the Russians in 2022 and 2023, as well as a campaign against the Russians in Crimea in 2024. So in some ways, the Americans are more involved and the British are more involved than they have been publicly disclosing. But what the story shows is the US and the British are not running the war. They've tried to influence the direction of the conflict, encouraging the Ukrainians to do certain things, such as focus their attention on taking Melitopol in the south in 2023. But time and time again, the Ukrainians have largely ignored that advice and often done things without even telling their partners in Wiesbaden what they're planning, such as when they sent forces across the Russian border into the Kursk region in August of 2024.
And do you think there's something that perhaps also the Americans were learning and the Brits were learning from their Ukrainian counterparts? Because I think one thing that's coming up very strongly now and that Ukraine is pointing to is the military advantage they have over their Western partners, how much faster, they can produce certain types of weapons, their edge that they have with their drone production as well. And I guess military tactics, they're trying out things that the West can only really think about in a theoretical sense. Do you think that the Americans and the Brits were learning something as well from their Ukrainian counterparts?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, this was, in some ways, a testing ground for, different strategies and different technologies. A great example of that is the maritime drones. The Americans provided a prototype maritime drone early in the war to the Ukrainians. And, that was largely not successful, that particular prototype. But in the 3 years that followed, the Ukrainians, with Western help, with the United States and British help, fielded maritime drones that were remarkably effective. And that alone, that one technology, will change the face of future conflicts. If there's a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, that capability that the Ukrainians basically tested and shared lessons learned with the United States might be employed against the Chinese Navy. The CIA was working closely, at least during the Biden administration, with the Ukrainians in conducting deep strikes using drones against military targets inside Russia, certain targets that had been approved for the CIA to work with the Ukrainians on. And those targets were defended by air defense systems, and the CIA would have to calculate how many drones the Ukrainians would have to send towards the target, knowing how many air defense systems and other types of defenses they'd have to get through. So they had to calculate how many are likely to get shot down on the way, how many drones are required. The level of sophistication that both the CIA and their Ukrainian counterparts had to develop to ensure that those drones made it through to the target is really a remarkable advance in that capability. And that, again, is something that is going to shape the future of any conflict that the US military or the British end up fighting.
And I mean, reading the article, it almost feels like I'm reading sort of about history because it's so removed from what would happen now, I guess. The US is withdrawing from Yashonka, which is this key hub for exchanging information and equipment and so on, with the Ukrainians in Poland, leaving it in the hands of other NATO allies. So they're distancing themselves as much as they possibly can, really, from the Ukrainians. Does that mean that the US is missing out, especially as you were bringing up Taiwan as an example and their deterrence of China and their kind of desire to keep China at bay effectively? Do you think the US is missing out now by withdrawing from that partnership with Ukraine?
If the US decides to basically abandon the Ukrainians, then yeah, they potentially would miss out on those capabilities that the Ukrainians are experimenting with and getting those lessons learned. That is definitely a possibility. But at the moment, at least, they haven't severed those ties yet. They're still providing them with intelligence and they're still providing them with equipment. How much longer they will do that, I don't know. But obviously, the risk of abandoning the Ukrainians would be that the Americans would find themselves on the sidelines of that. And presumably, if the Europeans continue or increase their support to Ukraine, they're the ones who are going to be more potentially directly benefiting from these things.
And that was Adam Enters there, talking to Monocle's Julia Lassica. You're listening to Monocle Radio. 14:40 in Manila, 8:40 a.m. in Zurich. Now, every year since the US closed its military bases in the Philippines, joint exercises have taken place between the two countries' armed forces. Called the Balikatan exercises, their purpose is to ensure the other's territory is properly defended were it to come under attack. Well, this year they've scaled up to what's been described as a full battle test, with more troops and more activity right up to the edge of the disputed South China Sea. Well, I'm joined now by Richard Haydarian, academic and columnist for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. Good afternoon, Richard.
Good morning.
We have a slight delay on your line, but we'll persevere with it. Just explain to us the nature of this scaling up. It is a big step up this year, isn't it?
Yes, it's a big step up, but also the timing is important because I know very well from my conversations in Brussels the other month that Europeans and a lot of U.S. allies are having concerns about the Trump administration's commitment to its long-standing alliances. As far as the Philippines is concerned, Pete Hegseth was here a few weeks ago, and it looks like Secretary Marco Rubio is also heading here. The fact that the Philippines will be holding arguably its largest and most sophisticated and most consequential bilateral military exercises with the Americans, along with Australians and Japanese, and not to mention half a dozen European countries, not only France, Germany, and the United Kingdom as observers, but also 4 new European countries will also be observers. I think it's a very strong show of force in terms of the bilateral alliance with the United States, but also it shows how the Philippines has become a vortex of kind of a de facto coalition of constrainment, if not deterrence, against a rising China.
When you mean a coalition of constrainment, this is effectively a very strong message being sent to Beijing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just look at the size, for instance. We're talking about up to 17,000 troops, which is slightly higher than last year. But last year itself was already historic in terms of its proportions. It's the new weapon systems, including the NMESIS anti-ship missile system that the Americans will be deploying. The Americans also just cleared the $5.6 billion F-16 upgraded fighter jet deal with the Philippines. A second Typhoon missile system could be coming in. We had a long conversation about that. That's something that is troubling the Chinese. And more important is also the geography and the direction of the military exercises. Some of the exercises, for instance, will be in the northern Philippines facing Taiwan. And that is important because the Philippine military chief, General Bronner, recently said that it's almost inevitable for the Philippines to be part of deterring a conflict in Taiwan or be involved in preventing China from forcibly taking over Taiwan. So it's not only South China Sea, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief operations, things that were quite always de rigueur component of our security alliance with the United States. But the Taiwan element is becoming more and more poignant as far as our bilateral exercise is concerned. So as far as the Philippines is concerned, it looks like the Trump administration is business as usual, if not an upgrade on past exercises and bilateral cooperation.
And how have Beijing reacted to this?
If I'm not mistaken, last year I was going through the set of observers. I think last year Beijing had observers. But this year I was looking through the nations, through the list of nations who were invited. It looks like China is not there. China obviously is not happy. They have been already raising concerns with the Typhoon missile deployment last year. This is the advanced mobile medium-range missile system the Philippines is hosting. This is very advanced. It can target Chinese military bases in southern China, which will inevitably be involved in any Taiwan contingency plan. The Americans are saying they may send a second one to the Philippines, and the Philippines is saying that this year they're going to have integrated missile defense system exercises with the Americans, and the Philippines is looking forward towards acquiring even more of those weapon systems. From my understanding, in the coming weeks and months, there'll be other major heads of state from other key partner nations, maybe one from Europe, one from Asia, also heading to Manila. So big things are happening. So in the Philippines, it looks like there's a lot of strategic reassurance coming from the Trump administration, at least on the China question.
Richard Haydarian, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Manila. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
With UBS, you have a truly global partner, incorporating new technologies, innovative approaches, and unexpected opportunities, leading you to insights that help answer the questions that matter, delivered with passion, care, and unmatched expertise. Because it's about rising with the dawn each day, knowing that we can do even better. That's what banking is to us. Not just work, but a craft. UBS. Banking is our craft.
Now, economic warfare has become a decisive tool in the struggle for geopolitical power in the 21st century. America's stranglehold on this battlefront has resulted in a stunning resurgence of state power in a world supposedly governed by market forces. Well, that's the view of Edward Fishman, former member of the policy planning staff at the US State Department, and he details it fully in his new book, Chokepoints, How the Global Economy Became a Weapon of War. Well, Monocle's Andrew Muller sat down with Edward in London to talk about the book, and he began by asking if tariffs are really that effective as an economic weapon.
Historically speaking, tariffs have been used primarily as a tool of domestic economic policy more than as a tool of economic warfare. So very early in American history, dating back to the time of George Washington, the United States used tariffs to raise government revenue. This was before the U.S. had the income tax. Mind you, at the time, the U.S. government was tiny, right? So it was much smaller than it is today, and the revenue that was needed to run the government was much smaller. A second reason, and in more recent history, that the United States has used tariffs is to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. And even during Joe Biden's administration, Biden imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles because there was a fear that Chinese electric vehicles, being so efficient, so cheap, if they were allowed into the U.S. market, would undercut American companies like Tesla. What Trump has done is he's been talking about those two reasons, the revenue reason and defending domestic industry. But he's also added this third reason, which is economic warfare, basically using tariffs as this all-purpose weapon that he can use to coerce Mexico to beef up security at the border with the U.S., or even coerce Canada to try to become the 51st state. And in that vein, he is thinking about tariffs much more like we would traditionally think of sanctions.
There is an idea attached to the sanctions that you discuss in your book, which I do want to ask about, because you make the comparison between current financial choke points and the old school choke point, those geographic ones like the Straits of Hormuz or the Bosphorus, control over which has been a matter of empires rising and falling. Do they matter as much in a world where so many transactions are not physical, where so much commerce is virtual?
Yeah. Geographic choke points are still relevant, and look no further than the Houthis disrupting shipping. So, I mean, clearly they still have relevance, but I think that their relevance has been declining over the last 100 years. First, with the creation of things like the airplane, where much of global shipping can occur without actually transiting these straits. Of course, there are certain commodities like oil that do need to go on tankers. But I think more to the point is what you said, where the more important choke points today really are these invisible choke points, like the U.S. dollar-based financial system, like semiconductor supply chains. But I don't want to undersell the Strait of Hormuz. You still have something like a fifth of global oil sales going through that strait every single year, and so it is an incredibly important choke point still.
But is there something still appealing about those as an instrument of leverage? Because there's a drama to that, and there is something theatrical about sanctions, is the point I'm making. They are also a gesture. You're saying this is a thing we will not stand for, and this is our response. Is there a drama attached to maybe closing down a strait that just isn't attached to closing down a particular avenue of somebody's finances?
Yes, but there's also a higher risk, because if you're trying to close down a strait, that's going to require the use of military force, right? You're going to have to use the Navy. And this is, I think, the biggest evolution that I talk about in my book, Chokepoints, and why I do define this new age of economic warfare as beginning really in the early part of the 21st century. Because even if you go back to as recently as the 1990s, when the U.S. and the rest of the UN imposed an embargo on Saddam Hussein's Iraq, in order to stop Iraq from selling oil on global markets, we used a multinational naval force that was patrolling the Persian Gulf, inspecting Iraqi tankers 24/7 for 13 straight years, right? The risk of a campaign like that is, you could easily get into a shooting war, right? And in order to try to break the blockade, you could have missiles fired at your ship. You could have torpedoes. You could have other acts of sabotage. I think the novelty of modern economic warfare and using invisible choke points like the dollar is it doesn't require the deployment of military resources. And as a result, it allows a president like Donald Trump at the stroke of a pen to deploy very aggressive economic warfare on foreign countries. And so in some ways, the threshold for the use of economic warfare has gone way down because we no longer have to put our soldiers and sailors in harm's way, while the impact has gone way up.
Just as a final thought then, are we getting any better at deploying sanctions and understanding what works and what doesn't? Because you mentioned Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and I remember traveling there when it was under sanction and visiting, some of its schools and hospitals, which were about the most depressing places you can possibly imagine, while Saddam Hussein was building vast monuments to himself all over Baghdad. And this is an argument you will be familiar with, that they affect the people who are already suffering and they don't affect the people who aren't. And I guess I would round that question off by saying what I recall a friend of mine in Belgrade saying when Serbia was under sanctions during the time of Slobodan Milosevic, and she just shrugged, what good does the West think is going to come of locking us in a cage with a lunatic?
Yeah. Look, I think that what you're saying is accurate, and I think we need to acknowledge the fact that even today with these more targeted sanctions, oftentimes it is everyday people who bear the brunt of them. And I think what that means isn't that we should never use these tools. It means that we better have a damn good reason to do so. And we should only do so when there is a vital national security interest at stake and where we have a clear goal in mind. So, I think probably in my book, what I consider the most successful use of sanctions in recent history are the sanctions that led up to the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. And if you look at how those worked, right, they did have broad-based economic effects on the Iranian people, right? They degraded the Iranian rial. They caused a massive recession in 2013, right? When you have a currency that has been degraded, everything is more expensive. So the Iranian people suffered, right? But thankfully, it so coincided with an election in June of 2013 in which one candidate, Hassan Rouhani, publicly 2 weeks before the election, said that we should negotiate with the West to try to get the sanctions lifted. And that led to a groundswell of support where he won over 50% of the vote in an 8-person race. And that put enough pressure on Ayatollah Khamenei that they realized they had to negotiate away this nuclear program or there could be a massive revolt. That was, in my view, a very elegant way to use sort of popular discontent to create political change and ultimately resolving concerns about Iran's nuclear program without going to war. But, that doesn't always happen. And sometimes, we just cause economic pain without, being able to translate it into political gain. And I think that's the tragedy sometimes of modern economic warfare.
And that was the American author Edward Fishman in conversation with Andrew Muller at our studio in London. Chokepoints, How the Global Economy Became a Weapon of War, is out now. You're listening to The Globalist. Finally, on today's programme, let's talk fashion. Benedict Brown is a fashion journalist and consultant specialising in menwear. He joins me in the studio. Very good morning to you. Welcome, Benedict.
Good morning.
Let's talk about London and Savile Row, the preserve of the male tailor for the man. That's changing.
That is changing. Savile Row is a place that's very, very dear to my heart. Has forever, since its existence, always been a male-dominated space. And only in the last few years has that started to change. And most recently with the announcement that Caroline Andrew, a bespoke tailor, and Emma Willis, a bespoke shirt maker, have joined forces and are opening up shop together on Old Burlington Street, which is, a stone's throw from Savile Row. It's very much part of the fabric of Savile Row. Emma Willis makes shirts for King Charles and many other notable people, and Caroline Andrew as well cuts bespoke tailoring for men and women, and they are both exceptional craftspeople. And it's great to see. It really underlines the fact that Savile Row is changing. The men's tailoring world is changing, and it paves the way for kind of future female craftspeople to kind of set up shop on their own and go out there and do their thing.
Why is it so hard for women to break into this part of the world of fashion?
I just think that it's kind of always perhaps been seen as a space that's perhaps not designed and made for women to kind of make a mark in. I think it's, like I said, it's traditionally always been men. It's always been a kind of quite a secretive industry as well. It was only since the 70s that Savile Row used to be completely shrouded in mystery. You couldn't see into any bespoke tailors' shops. It was for gentlemen only, and you never spoke about your tailor. And I think that kind of never really set the course for women to kind of break into. A couple of years ago, Daisy Natchbull it was called The Deck and now called Natchbull. She opened up a shop on Savile Row, and she was the first ever female businesswoman to open up shop on Savile Row. And so that was kind of where it's all started. And now Caroline and Emma, it's kind of continuing.
Let's move inevitably to touching on the death of Pope Francis. It is astonishing how much the Catholic Church and the grandeur and the intricacy of costume has played such an enormous part, not just in the Catholic Church itself, but in fashion. And what we saw with Pope Francis was that real dialing back, that there were no more Prada slippers, it was plain black shoes. And he dressed as a parish priest. He did not have the grandiose nature of his predecessors. The influence of the Catholic Church in fashion is huge, isn't it?
It really is. I think it probably doesn't get as much credit as it probably deserves. I think when you think of the Catholic Church, you like you just said, you do think of this kind of sense of grandeur, and it's very very opulent and everything like that. But Francis really shunned that. He was very pared back and understated, and perhaps he was a bit ahead of the times when that kind of quiet luxury trend that came in. He really championed sustainability as well, which is obviously extremely important. But the influence of the Catholic Church is far-reaching. In 2018, it was kind of the basis of inspiration for the Met Gala, and then Rihanna kind of stole the show with this platinum-like robe with papal crown, and it was, it's an iconic moment, to say the least. So it's constantly been a source of inspiration. And then most recently, I haven't seen it yet, but the Conclave with Ralph Fiennes won several BAFTAs and many other awards, but even won a film for Best Fashion as well, which is quite impressive.
Indeed, it was the Cut gave it the best fashion film. That said, there is this glorious area of tradition in craftsmanship. Just wandering around the back of the Vatican a couple of weeks ago, shop upon shop upon shop of the most glorious clothes. Church clothes, everything from from sort of ceremonial clothes to your basic clothing. It has a real tradition and artisanship that we are sadly seeing disappear so much from the world of clothing and fashion.
For sure. Ceremonial dress here in England is certainly all made around Savile Row, we've just spoken about. But when it comes to the Vatican, the clothes are striking. It really kind of stops you in your tracks to think, like, where are these things made, and how are they made, and who is making them? And it begs the question: is there a secret Savile Row somewhere near the Vatican?
I'm sure there is. Benedict Brown, thank you so much for joining me in the studio here on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers, Laura Kramer, Chris Chermak and Hassan Anderson. Our researcher was Gunnar Grönled and our studio manager was Steph Chungu, with editing assistance from Hunter Wang. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.